Well, hello and welcome to the third episode of Cross Aisle Talk, a podcast about how BIPOC mental health practitioners and scholars can work together to better support BIPOC communities and each other. My name is Dr. Donna Dimanarig, and today I'm excited to have with us a good friend of mine, Dr. Liza Hita. And Dr. Hita is a clinical associate professor of psychology and director of online programming and digital immersion for the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. She received a master's degree in community counseling from Northern Arizona University and a Ph.D. in counseling psychology from Arizona State University. Her research focuses on preventive interventions for families experiencing major life transitions, including high conflict and never married or divorcing parents. Her current research and practice are focused on the online administration of parenting interventions and creating sustainable community embedded supervision models. Her community work focuses on bridging health disparities through culturally restorative, holistic practices. She's a full spectrum doula working with urban Indigenous families, sharing traditional prenatal, birthing, and postpartum practices and providing loss support. And welcome.
I am so excited to be having a great conversation with you. Thank you for that illustrative introduction.
Of course, anytime. I'm glad that you're here. And just for those of you who don't know, I met Dr. Hita through the CNPAMI Leadership Development Institute as a fellow. She is a fellow. And I'm just excited to have her be a part of Cross Aisle Talk to lend her expertise on the subject matter that we will be discussing today. So, you did your undergraduate studies in political science, history, and Chicanic studies. How did you decide to pursue counseling?
So this is so interesting because I literally just had a conversation with a bunch of social justice and human rights master's degree students yesterday. I was doing a workshop on vicarious trauma and racial battle fatigue in the field and in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did some kind of like interesting kind of pedagogical approach to this where we do like a theoretical framing and
Mm-hmm.
then we share our narratives as something that we consider to be, valid knowledge, our stories. And so when I was writing up, my piece of that workshop, I was like, my path was really unconventional, but it's truly
Mm-hmm.
interdisciplinary, right? So I grew
Right.
up in California and I never actually had any interest in psychology at all. I was mostly interested in activism. So when I went
Mm-hmm.
to UCLA, I wanted to do work for the people, whatever that meant at that time. So there were a lot of really important struggles that were going on in the mid 90s. One
Mm-hmm.
of them in particular was the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on January 1st, 1994. And so I was really inspired by social justice movements locally, nationally, and internationally. So when I went to UCLA, I double majored in political science and history, and I had a specialization in Chicano-Chicana studies. And, I thought, okay, well, this is how I'm going to learn about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I studied international political theory, and I actually like quickly became disillusioned. At that time the political science department at UCLA was very conservative, and so I was learning a lot about liberalism, a lot about neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I even have some of my books to this day where I was like, wow, I was taught how to colonize like an
Mm-hmm.
industrializing country. I have a book on called like Debt Doctors about how to, you know, depress economies and through austerity and education. And as a
Mm-hmm.
fellow Pinay, like we have a lot of English words in Tagalog and other, like people use Colgate, that's like toothpaste, right?
Right.
We have this
Yep.
we have
Yep.
these intentional English words woven into what used to be a traditional language, and that's very purposeful, right? So um, I was like on a concurrent program there, that I was also going to get a master's degree in Latin American studies. And I wanted to be a labor union organizer. I wanted to be a labor lawyer. So a lot of people that go into political science kind of choose those types of careers. It's a pretty like typical background. And I went to Chiapas one summer and I came back like a very different person. So I decided, you know what, I was already done with my bachelor's degree. Um, I had actually taken the LSAT and applied to law school.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I am not going to finish. I had one more year to do in the Latin American like concurrent master's program. I'm like, I'm
Mhm.
not going to do that. I'm not going to go to law school. I need to work in my community.
Mhm.
So, much to my parents' chagrin, mainly my mom, who was like, oh, like, of course she wanted me to be a lawyer.
Mhm.
Um, and I started to do community organizing and working for labor unions and doing some community health organizing. So, how does this even segue into counseling? Is
Mhm.
that, I was really involved in doing some of this political organizing, labor organizing. And as a relatively young mom and wife, I moved to Arizona. That was the deal when my husband and I got married. I knew what it was, but I didn't really know what it was.
Mhm.
I didn't know how different Arizona was going to be. There weren't a lot of me around,
Mhm.
and there certainly wasn't a progressive atmosphere. There just wasn't the type of labor union infrastructure um, or community organizing infrastructure. And so I had a young child, and we were living at the poverty line. So I needed to get a job.
Mhm.
And so I was literally thumbing through the paper. Like that's how long ago it was, where I was like circling, job ads in a paper. And I came across a job for something called a parenting aide. And I wasn't
Mm.
sure what that was, but when I was doing labor union organizing and community organizing, like that's what I was doing. I was in people's homes. I was essentially counseling them to see what they needed as a worker,
Mhm.
and addressing the epistemic violence and the systemic barriers to having workers' rights, to having equity, to having a living wage.
Mm.
So, part of that is that I needed to find something where my skill set had some like kind of lateral traction. And so
Mhm.
I went and I interviewed for this job, and they actually hired me as a therapist. This was before Arizona was a licensure state, and I ended up being pretty good at it. And this was really familiar, right? I was
Mhm.
working with what I consider to be when I went on into my graduate studies and postgraduate studies, when I was training a master's level counselors, I would always tell folks, I've been trench trained. I was trained
Mhm.
in the trenches because the very first families that I worked with were really high risk families. They're at risk for losing their kids to the state, right? To be
Mhm.
within state custody. At that time, it was called CPS here in Arizona. And so I was seeing pretty like atrocious things when my kids were also at the age of some of these children. It was a really hard job, and I did that job for about 3 years.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm like, if I can do this job here, like in these conditions with these families, highly resistant, highly dysfunctional families, um, dealing with things that a lot of counselors never see because they don't do home-based therapy. It's not in
Mhm.
our training to do that. In fact, it's kind of like taboo. That's kind of like
Right, right.
like social workers do that stuff,
Right, right. Mhm.
and counselors often are resistant to going to people's homes. We're not trained like that, but I was
Mhm.
trained like that. So I ended up being pretty good at this. And so, when it was pretty evident that you were going to need a license in Arizona, I went back to go get my master's in counseling. And that's how I initially got into counseling.
Mhm.
But, counseling and psychology are really different, right? So, um, like, I had about maybe 1 year of overlap of a 2.5 year program. Like, that's how different they are. Is that, I
Mhm.
mean, if that. That it's a different, I think, especially counseling psychologists in the program that I went to really think of themselves as scientist practitioners,
Mhm.
and with a scientist first, right? So it's about cultivating your skills as an independent researcher, but also being attuned as a clinician. But
Right.
I do think that the scientist is purposefully first within my profession. So I actually didn't even think about going on to get a PhD. I mean, when I went back for my master's degree, I had 2 kids by then. And so I was like, I was just trying to like make it through.
Mhm.
But once I got in quickly into the program, I met somebody who was incredibly dynamic, and she's actually very involved in APA, Dr. Evie Garcia. So
Yeah,
she was
I
my,
knew you were gonna say that.
I mean, she was my first identified mentor. I had
Right.
people you know, who I liked taking their classes, in undergraduate, and who I was very fond of, and I thought they were
Mm-hmm.
interesting. But she really taught me about what mentorship looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was so enthralled with her. I was like, wow, what did you do what you do? She was just so sharp
Yeah.
and so funny, and she just knew a bunch of things that I thought were like so interesting. And because I
Yeah.
really didn't have a lot of mentorship, I like she told me, she has a PhD in counseling psychology, and I wasn't told, like, I had never even heard of that really. I didn't know what
Mm-hmm.
it was. I don't have any background. I didn't take one psychology class in undergrad, zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really know it. I didn't know what it was. And then actually early on, I met another professor. His name is Dr. Scott Herman, and he taught adolescent psychology. He was a super good professor. And he went to UCLA for his undergrad, and then he went to get a PhD at ASU. And I'm like, oh, well, I that's me, So
Yep.
I literally just kind of followed this. I didn't have a really adventurous track. Like when I went to UCLA, I was living in San Diego at the time. I just kind of went up the road.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was going to go back and get, advanced graduate studies, I was like, I have a family. I want to stay in Arizona. Like I want to go to ASU. I did not even know it was a good program until people were like coming from Yale and Rutgers and
Mm-hmm.
Northwestern. And I was like, why is everyone coming to ASU? Like, I didn't even look like that it was a top tier program. And I just went because one, I, I mean, the most honest reason for getting a PhD in counseling psychology for me at that time
Mm-hmm.
was to defer my loans. I was like, wow, like a master's level counselor just does not make a lot of money,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Um, and
Yeah.
I had two little kids. There was a lot of stuff going on in my life. So I kind of went into these fields for survival.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes folks are like, oh, wow, that I had a lot of kind of like personal turmoil going on. And so going to school was my coping,
Mm-hmm.
and I coped because school was consistent. If I show up at school and I do well, then I can get an A. And when a lot of other things in my life were so uncertain and precarious,
Mm-hmm.
school was for sure. I knew what to do in there. And then like, I was a smart kid. I was good at school. So I certainly didn't feel passion for psychology. Um, I did what kind of the next step led me to. And
Mm-hmm.
because I had some mentors that suggested I do that and really encouraged and helped me, it was an easy decision to make. If I didn't get into the PhD program at ASU, I would probably have an MFA in creative writing.
Oh, well, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that you loved about what you did in undergrad was activist work.
Mhm.
Now, how are you interweaving activist work into your current career in counseling psychology?
So, I mean, a part of me really mourns that. Like,
Mm.
a part of me feels placeless. I have like amazing colleagues that are political scientists and anthropologists and, sociologists who
Mm-hmm.
study kind of like stateless people. People without a state, what that means for them, kind of in the democratic sphere of things. And professionally, like in my discipline, I kind of feel stateless. Like I feel like political science and history plus psychology is kind of like sociology. And I actually
Mm-hmm.
used to teach sociology. It was actually a really good fit for me. That was my first academic job. I was teaching in a
Mm-hmm.
sociology and family studies program. So I think that for a lot of me, because remember, I didn't go into this feeling passion. I went into
Mm-hmm.
this feeling interest, which is so different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like than feeling passion. Um, and so I think for a while I felt like I wasn't doing very much because I got into psychology in a PhD program, not knowing what psychology was, that it's a highly Eurocentric, highly white centering discipline
Right,
in
right.
its research studies, its research methodologies, whose call to the profession
Mm-hmm.
to look at the multicultural intersections didn't happen until 1992. Like it's a slow
Yeah.
moving train, you
Right.
know,
Right. Right.
or not even a train. It's like a slow moving like
Slug.
slug. Like it's like an old VW, exactly, like
Right.
in low gear.
Right.
So I felt discouraged by that.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of other life experience. I was a PhD student in a counseling psychology program with already 2 kids. I'm not sure how it was in your graduate program, but like really nobody had kids, just because there's so many clinical hours. So like maybe somebody
Right.
about 4 cohorts ahead of me, somebody like 3 cohorts behind me. But in general, people just don't have kids during their like counseling psychology program or clinical
Right.
psychology program. So, I mean, I do a lot of community work, so that could feed me. But within the discipline, that has been frustrating for me. So when I became an academician, I was like, I am going to infuse my classes with
Mm-hmm.
this information, right? So I teach critical race theory. In my classes, I have like an internal bar of like, I need to have 75% scholars of color highlighted in this
Mm-hmm.
course, um, across the developmental spectrum, right? Because of course there's like
Right. Right.
Franz Fanon and all of these like really like amazing prolific scholars that have since passed away. Um, and then there are like more contemporary scholars of color, but I also integrated scholars from other disciplines, like people like
Mm-hmm.
Dorothy Roberts, who is, a lawyer, but at the intersection of sociology and science and law, so that students could have a more well-rounded, what I consider to be a more well-rounded education. So
Mm-hmm.
I I created classes and taught in my classes utilizing things that, well, what I call multicultural and social justice praxis. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
make that up. That's part of like the pioneers in the field, and the multicultural competencies. They have a model of multicultural and social justice praxis, and that's what I
Right.
use. And I share that with my
Right.
students. I mean, so I try to do that. I will share that the classes that I develop with that type of curricula, they tend to be seen as elective and not centralized as core classes. And if I'm not teaching those classes, I'm having that right now, right? That I used to teach
Mm-hmm.
a cross cultural psychology, a graduate level class, and I'm not teaching that anymore. The person who's going to teach it has taken all of my material out. And it probably doesn't make as much sense for her. She's a white woman and she's a social
Mm.
psychologist. And so I understand that, like, a lot of what I teach is from my positionality. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is central, right? I don't detach myself from the information, but then I'm like, these students aren't going to learn that and they're not going to see it in another psychology class, not at my institution. So I think that that has been frustrating for me, but I'm also
Mm-hmm.
starting to now make really important strides and kind of bridges with a little bit more permanence across other disciplines. That's like the beautiful thing about where I work, is that it has like a truly like interdisciplinary like mission and thrust to it,
Mm-hmm.
where people are really tribal and they're like really in their discipline. And I'm not like that in general, like just not as a person. And because my interests are vast and
Mm-hmm.
this activist work is important to me, I've been looking for like, I don't want to be placeless, so I do think that people that tend to be in like the humanities or in social justice and human rights or in justice studies, um, or people who study literature, we have some, or people, as you're seeing by my little Zoom background, people who in general are like people of color, particularly faculty women of
Mm-hmm.
color. I try to do some collaborations with people who have like more ideological, symmetry with me, more critical edge than I would say that a lot of other psychologists have.
So,
So,
so it looks like you're actually doing a little bit of activist work then, even though it's probably not the type of activism that you envisioned
mhm.
before, but in a way you are doing that in your career.
Yeah, I mean, I was a president of our Faculty Women of Color caucus like 3 years ago, and I still continue to be on their leadership circle. So I think that like I'm justice minded. So if I
Mm-hmm.
find a space where I can be of service in that way, I yeah, I guess it's not activism like I'm used to,
Right.
but it is trying to, make forward movement to address, epistemic issues of
Mm-hmm.
inequity.
And I know that you've worked a lot with indigenous communities,
Mhm.
especially in your area. Can you tell me more about your work and how people outside of that community can actually be better allies,
Mhm.
for indigenous communities?
Well, I think this is multi-pronged, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, some of this, again, just like I encourage my students, this is part of my like reflexive praxis, right? My self-reflection and my knowledge of the world around me and how I fit in there. So, we're both Filipina. My dad's Ukrainian, my mom is from the Philippines. And so that's usually like the basic story, right? So for the
Mm-hmm.
outside audience, that is what I share that tends to like, check people's boxes. It gives them enough information to place me, right? Because often people can't place me.
Mm-hmm.
But underneath those stories, and I'll just focus in on my mom's side, is that, and of course, like Filipinos, like we're very regional and we take that pretty serious. And, so we're Visayan. My mom is from the island of Panay and we're from the province of Aklan. And her family, the Makahiligs, have been there for like 800 years. Like there's so much documentation of our family right where we live and around kind of like a triad of towns between
So
Banga,
it's
Leso, and
probably
Kalibu.
pre Spaniard
Oh,
colonization.
oh,
Yeah.
way, way, way
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, we can trace our lineage back to the original Datus that came from Borneo,
Oh
right?
wow. Okay.
Yeah. So because the Datos, they came to Panay first, and that's how they spread out through the Visay
Interesting.
and Mindanao,
Mm-hmm.
So I met a Datu like in my early 20s, right? And so I was doing some political work, the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines at the time. And this Datu came into town, and some of my friends were hosting him, and they're like, "Oh, you should talk to Liza. Like, she's like all into like indigenous stuff." And I was married to my husband already, and we were going to different traditional ceremony because
Mm-hmm.
he's Mexican and indigenous. And so I met this Datu, and once he found out where I was from, he kept telling my husband, "Your wife is my people. Like we're from the same place." He's like, go
Mm.
tell my wife. So he told me, he was like, "You know what? I'm looking for Hopi. I'm looking for Hopi people. Do you know any?" And I'm like, "I'm in Los
Mm.
Angeles. I do not know one single Hopi." And, to condense that story, he was like, "We're related to the Hopi. Our old stories connect us to Hopi people." And
Oh
he said, "You
wow.
should really get to know your relatives so that you don't have to feel far from home." And I think so many people in our, Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander diaspora know what that feels like to feel far from home, even when
Yeah.
you were born here, and especially somebody who is like mixed ethnicity like myself. um you again, that this whole aspect of placelessness, like
Mm-hmm.
where's your place. And he told me that, he said, you should get to know your Hopi relatives, so that you can know them, you don't have to feel far from home.
Mm-hmm.
um and as a very young impressionable person, I really took that to heart. And he also said, "Oh, he's looking for Sedona, we have a sacred site up there." And I didn't know much about Arizona at all. So when I came to Arizona, I took that also very seriously. And I immediately got involved in working in Native communities, partly because it was
Mm.
already our community because of my husband,
Mm-hmm.
um, but also because I remembered that. Like, oh, Hopis are our relatives. And immediately when I started to work at this place, it was called Indians for Wellness. It was part of the American Indian Prevention Coalition. I met a woman there, another therapist
Mm-hmm.
who was Hopi, and she was in the city, but I mean, she grew up in the Mesas. And so I kind of tried it out on her. So I was like, "Hey, we're relatives," and I told her what I was told. And she really took it seriously. She's like, "Yes, Hopis went all over the world."
Oh
You
wow.
know, she believed me, she understood that our cultures were migratory,
Mm-hmm.
that there's a lot of like mysticism and things that maybe we don't understand with like our limited senses, like our material world, but that our stories are connected. And because my people are of the water, right, from Aklan, she
Mm-hmm.
was like, she's Spider Clan, and so Water Clan are kind of like her aunties, right? So she would treat
Mm.
me like that. She would see me like that. And then her dad came in one time and to our office, and she was like, "Tell my dad your story." So I was like, "Hey, we're relatives," and I told him the whole story. And he also believed me, and he was like, "Oh, Young Corn Clan and Water Clan, like we're related," And he also has,
Mm.
like, they have a sacred site in Sedona as well. So I started to be like, okay, well, obviously I trusted this dato. He was a pretty well-known dato. He was already in the United States visiting,
Mm-hmm.
but also people around me, like, they trusted me and they heard me. And they have a lot of stories about, like, deities and energies coming from the water, from the west. And so we're all related. Like, I know people, who have done my traditional batok, my traditional tattoos, talk about how all of our language bases are also related. Like, we know that
Mm.
through the roots of our language, about how similar we are, especially to, like, Coast Salish and Haida, like Alaskan and Canadian and
Mm-hmm.
coastal people, because we're canoe people when we were migrating all around. So I share that with you because I got involved and invested in Indigenous communities because I see them as my relatives. I
Mm-hmm.
don't always share that. I'm sharing it on a podcast right now, but it's like the different layers,
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I really
uh,
do.
of how do we get into this work. And so some of
Yeah.
it, so the reason I'm also sharing this is that some of it is allyship, is that, like, somebody who's not of that identity. So I'm kind of in this, I'm on this cusp, right, where yes, I'm not indigenous to here, no, my people are not from here, no, I'm not enrolled in a tribe, or a nation, but yes, I know that we have connections that I'm still, even at my age, learning and exploring, about what people from my mom's island told me, what our datus told us, what people who are scholars of our people tell me, and kind of putting that into practice. And so
Mm-hmm.
once I started to work on the reservation, you start to know a lot of people, so we have these
Mm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
overlapping circles of people who are like our cultural and ceremonial community, and then other people who I was working on their reservation as a counselor. So I think that for people who maybe don't have that type of, like, kind of interlineage connection, whatever that might mean for them,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of connections people don't even know that they have. And I feel really
Right.
fortunate that people took the time to share that with me, right? That's special knowledge that, especially for families that come here and they migrate and then they highly assimilate those things,
Yeah.
they can sometimes die. Those stories, those knowledges, they're forgotten. So that I feel blessed that I know those things. But I also think that, especially, let's go back to my friend up in Hopi that I remember when I'd go and visit her.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously a lot of, like, non-Hopi people working up in Hopi, same with, like, all of the different reservations, especially to, like, in urban indigenous centers of health and wellness and hospitals. They can't just be, like, staffed by pure, like, just
Mm-hmm.
native folks. And so I think that to be, like, a really great ally is that, and this came from a very esteemed elder around here, is know yourself, know who you
Mm-hmm.
are, right? Even if you don't identify with a culture, like, often, some of my students, they will identify as white. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, well, what was your family before they were white? White, like, white is a classification, it's a color, it's not a
Right.
culture. There
Right.
is a culture connected to whiteness, but um in one of my classes, I haven't taught it in several years, but I had every student do a migration story, and people would be like, "We're from here," and I'm like, "Yeah, but you're not. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we don't know where we're from, but somebody does. Like, ask around. Maybe that weird aunt that people are always like, oh, ask
Yeah.
her." And so, I think that to be a good ally, going back to, I think what people call cultural competencies, I've moved towards the language of culturally responsive, or
Mm-hmm.
cultural humility.
I like that.
Is that
Yeah.
because competency infers that you master something, and I'm like, we
Right.
never
Right.
master culture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we want to be responsive to, cultural difference, to
Mm-hmm.
cultural diversity, but I think people should really know themselves, know their positionality, know how they're entering a community. And somebody shared an article the other day with me about how white supremacy infiltrates organizations, right? How it shows up, and we don't even know that it's white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important. That there's a difference between white supremacy and racism, right? It's just like white dominant culture, right? Which is everywhere. So people hear white supremacy and they think of like, the Ku Klux Klan, they think of like lynching. And I'm like, no, it's that is the cultural hegemonic
Yeah.
power, right? It's just
Yeah.
kind of the supreme dominant value system of the land.
Right.
So, I think that people have to know those things about themselves, especially with pacing, right? So, this past year, this has been such an interesting experience to be a woman of color at the university where everyone now cares about issues that nobody cared about, And I was
Yeah.
like, you know, it took a murder.
Yep.
It took a murder, a public lynching of George Floyd. And then
Yeah.
again, a year later, well, besides the whole re-traumatizing nature of this trial, but then the Asian women
Yeah.
who were murdered in Georgia, and people kind of raising that to the top of the news, when like anti-Asian hate is old, or
It's the
all of
buzzword now, nowadays. It's the it's the in thing.
right, and so I was like, it took a lot for people to understand that. And then they want some of us who are doing this work to move at their accelerated pace. So immediately, I'm so fortunate for the amazing, dynamic, and grounded women of our Faculty Women of Color Caucus at my university, that they were like, first of all, people have been doing this work, and please, with humility, go at the pace and the directives of the impacted communities. So I think that some ways that white supremacy shows up in organizations and in people's kind of workflow is this sense of urgency all the time, right? That things need to get done, or a sense of efficiency where the deliverable is more important than what's going on with the people. And if you're working in Native communities, I've learned to go at the pace of the people. And that doesn't mean it's always slow. I had somebody really kind of, well, she didn't school me. I was listening to her teach some young Native folks. I was a counselor at what we call a feeder school right outside the reservation, where a lot of Native kids go to high school. And they were saying, "Oh, it's Indian time." And she was like, "Stop saying that. Indian time doesn't mean late." Like, our people knew what time was. Like, they knew how to get up early. They knew when they needed to tend to their fields. They knew when they needed to make those like long runs, because there's a lot of people in my region here, in Akamal Atam and Pipash territory, that are traditional runners.
Oh, wow.
So she was like, "No, we knew what time was." She's like, that concept of being like lazy or late, or not being on time, she's like, that was given to us, that wasn't ours. So she's like, told them, don't say that. If you want to say Indian time, make sure it's like the best part of your time, not like blowing off another obligation. So when I think about that Indian time, I was always like, I have to just be aware of how people move. Like, do they understand
Yeah.
a 50-minute session? Not because they can't understand it, but it's like, I want to create trust, particularly in communities where outside people have come in and damaged trust. So it's like, know yourself, know the history, and get to know the people. Like, it's not a race to the treatment plan. Sometimes, I would break bread. I would have a meal with the family. Sometimes I do an interview, not an interview. I do a guest lecture on multicultural clinical interviewing for a doctoral program at my university. And we talk about this multicultural code of ethics, right? And I remember I was at the Multicultural Summit probably back in 2004. And Daryl Wing Sue was there. That's why I remember
Oh.
it so much. It was like my first college conference. Maybe it was 2005 or something. It was early on in my graduate career. And I don't know how I had the nerve, but like, they asked if people had thoughts about multicultural ethics. And I got on the stage and I like talked about stuff, but I was working on the reservation at that time. And so, I was like, we have to be malleable because ethics are to protect people. They're not to hurt people. They're not to harm people. And so if you're doing things that are, in the vein or within the guidelines of the ethics that are not helping the people, you need to recalibrate. And the best way to do that is really to seek consultation and to check in with yourself.
Mhm, mhm.
And so I remember that so well because Daryl Wing Su got on the stage after me, and he he kind of gave me a pat on the back, and like he appreciated the comments that I had
Mhm.
made. So that was like one of my highlights, like forever. But I do think that if people know themselves, they know the history, and they get to know the community at the pace and the directives of the people that they are serving, they can have a really positive experience, working in communities. And I think that, um, always asking,
Mhm.
there's a lot of stuff that people don't know and then they're afraid to ask. Um,
Yeah.
that, questions are important. It's a good learning experience for people. And sometimes I would go to community events. I wouldn't do that. I used to counsel at the university. I wasn't going to like student led events.
Mhm.
I mean, that doesn't seem appropriate. But if I wanted to work in the community, I had to be visible. I had to
Mhm.
show up in other ways. So I wouldn't say that like every indigenous community is the same, obviously, but I do think that that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and I do agree with you in terms of, to be a good ally, you do need to have an awareness of yourself and an awareness of the community that you want to work with. It is definitely easier said than done, especially when the system that we are working under is working the way it's supposed to be, meaning that it's a white supremacy system.
Mhm,
And to be able to overcome that, it's almost like that's a insurmountable feat to
mhm,
do. And for a lot of our students of color, our BIPOC students, getting to know themselves, it's like, where do we start? Because a lot of our history has been erased.
mhm. Yeah. Um, That's so true. It can be hard.
Yeah.
And it can be re traumatizing to have to do that deep dive,
Right, right.
within oneself. And I think the fact that you brought up training is really important because in our clinical training, we're not really taught that, right?
No, no, definitely not.
We're not taught to really be culturally responsive, and
Mhm.
we're not necessarily taught how to deal with our own cultural parameters. I mean,
Mhm.
you
Yep.
know, we go through our own kind of therapeutic process, but it's not like culture's at like in the front seat of the car driving.
Yeah.
It's kind of ancillary. And so I've tried to really recenter that in the work that I do clinically and, in the academy, because otherwise it will always be secondary. Part of
Mhm.
one of my favorite projects of being an LDI fellow that we know in this Leadership Development Institute was working on this warrior path task force,
Mhm.
that discussed, you know, decoloniality in
Mhm.
psychology, and it went out to all the divisions. It was such an honor to be part of that paper, but to meet other psychologists that
Mhm.
were really talking about truth and reconciliation, the harm that psychology has done, and the
Mhm.
reparative measures in order to move forward, as well as recalibrating our lens to look at things through a decolonial lens, which in saying that, you have to acknowledge colonialism. You have to
Right.
acknowledge the history. You have to acknowledge the damage, and how psychology continues to be complicit in that,
Yeah.
and how it continues to uphold white centered ideals
Right.
through education, through
Mhm.
accreditation, through all of the hoops
Yep.
that inherently disadvantage people who are already marginalized.
I can only imagine how you get a lot of resistance from that.
Well, I usually don't talk about it. I mean, I think that in psychology, I've learned how to kind of fit in with colleagues who
Mm.
are friendly. And, even at the university, I think like, well, I do a lot of this work that I call transformation and belonging, right? I
Mhm.
think that other, universities call it like justice, equity, diversion, that too, diversity and inclusion, or DEI work. I'm really just starting to solidly categorize it as transformation and belonging. Those are the things that I'm interested in because they feel
Mm.
action oriented versus descriptive. So when when I'm engaging in some of these conversations, sometimes people are like, well, like, what do you do? Or they'll be like, what does Liza do? Or, um, because my research portfolio doesn't point to that, right? Like, I'm a prevention scientist that, creates and studies interventions, right? With an
Mhm.
emphasis on implementation and dissemination. And as you mentioned, I work with high conflict families and divorced and separated families.
Mhm.
But most of my work right now is with bereaved families. And I'm starting to,
Yeah.
put together a research portfolio in, prison impacted families or programs for caregivers of children with an incarcerated parent. So I don't stick out like on the DEI radar. I don't like, because I don't have like a portfolio of research that says that I do that work, but
Mhm.
I embody that work. Like, I'm a non tenured clinical faculty member at a primarily white serving institution where
Mhm.
faculty women of color are paid at the lowest rungs across disciplines and
Oh,
across
wow.
ranks.
Oh, wow.
um so I was like, well, yes, I don't study it, but I live it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so, I haven't really discussed these things within psychology because I haven't really found a place. And at some point, I
Mhm.
think you have to make decisions about who you're going to work with. Like, are you going to try to like
Right.
drag your discipline along,
Right.
or are you going to just find people who want to work to better systems that include everybody?
Yeah. And you also, I know that you mentioned that you work with bereaved families.
Mhm.
I'm wondering how much more challenging it is during the pandemic and the quarantine and isolation. How bereavement looks nowadays when most people can't even practice, their culturally based bereavement process. Because there are
Mhm.
culturally based processes that people go through, and because of the isolation, as we during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can't really do that. How has that affected the community that you've been working with?
Well, I mean, to say it simply, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard for people. And so, part of the work, so again, there's always two sides to things, lots of different sides, is that, and I'll start with, the resilience model that all of the work that I do is rooted
Mm-hmm.
in. So I do a lot of clinical supervision, secondary and tertiary supervision. So I supervise leaders running groups.
Mm-hmm.
They're mainly like psychoeducational groups, parenting support group. Well, I wouldn't even call them parenting support groups, but they offer support through parenting, and
Mm-hmm.
parenting skills. And so I train and I supervise group leaders to do that, and then I train and supervise supervisors. So, what I have learned in my time working with bereaved families is that they have this like incredible reservoir of strength, that they are both simultaneously experiencing maybe one of the worst things that have ever happened to them, right? And these families, they're families that have lost another major caregiver in their life. So it's not necessarily families that have lost a child, which are also bereaved families. These are
Yeah.
families that have lost typically another parent or a major caregiver. Um, so it's this living caregiver plus children. That's the family constellations that I'm working with, and they are simultaneously grieving and in pain,
Mm.
which doesn't, people don't like get over it.
Right.
That's not the grief model, and we don't go through the stages. We don't use the stages of grief model either. This is really
Mm-hmm.
about people making meaning in their life, and really discovering their new normal,
Mm-hmm.
that they're going through all of this and they get up and they go to work and they're raising kids, and they just have this incredible set of skills, like if we were talking about kind of counselor to client type of transference, we'd be calling this, vicarious resilience, versus vicarious trauma. But they are living that resilience. And so I'm amazed at these families. And so, the counselors, and they're not even all counselors. Some of them are counselors. A lot of them are, paraprofessionals or volunteers that work in like bereavement agencies.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about these kind of concurrent streams of like grief consciousness, right? The fragility model and the resilience model, that yes, people are hurting, and yes, they feel tender, but tender and fragile are different, right? Like if you had a
Mhm.
bruise on your arm, that's tender, but you're not broken. You
Mhm.
know, you're in pain.
Right.
And that's often how grief is. So because I know that, because I've seen so many, families go through these parenting groups. And remember, we don't usually have people in these groups that have just lost a loved one, right? They're
Mhm.
usually probably at least 2 months. That's really early too. Usually like 6 months or more, sometimes years after the death.
Oh.
Especially like when younger kids start to have like additional questions about the
Mhm.
death of a parent, and they kind of come back into like grief support services, because it gets hard at all sorts of different stages, of people's
Right.
lives, for both children and adults. So I would say that it's a different kind of hard, but it's always kind of hard and always really inspiring, in very similar ways despite circumstances. But it's also bringing up a lot of, at least to me in my work, and it's drawing in my attention that people are dealing from obviously COVID death, and what
Mhm.
somebody I also make a podcast for this uh, project that I'm working on with bereaved families. They talk about a general culture of loss.
Mm.
Um, and how they've lost everything, like their freedom, their normalcy,
Yeah.
their jobs. So there's this general culture of loss with COVID and quarantine and all of that. And then there's the complex trauma that so many communities are going through. And a lot of those communities, they're at the intersections of culture and class. They tend to be poor, dealing with so much more stress during the pandemic, just because of like, the economic scarcity,
Right.
of what's happening right now, that has really impacted poor communities. And a lot of them tend to be communities of color that were already experiencing epistemic violence,
Mhm.
and now COVID. So it's just another layer of this complex
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
And this amazing woman that I interviewed from West Philadelphia, her name is Movita. She, and I can't wait, we're working on her podcast episode right now,
Mhm.
of her interview, but she said something so deeply meaningful, that like, you know for kids that are seeing death around them from COVID, but also from violence, also emotional and spiritual death,
Mhm.
in their communities. And they're dealing with food insecurity, and they're dealing with economic hardship. And you send them off to school, like you cannot expect them to be well. Like
Mhm.
that doesn't make sense.
Right.
Um, and so like addressing those issues are what we need for our kids to be well. Like, it's a big responsibility, but we also just have to be honest with ourselves as a society, that there's all of these things going on at once,
Mhm.
right? Not for everyone, but for some people, right?
Right.
And
Right.
grief can be layered like that. And so we have to look at all of that. Like we can't just choose to look at one aspect of this.
Mhm.
So I do think that it's bringing a lot of important conversations to the forefront. And of course, the people that I work with, the amazing teams that have been doing grief work for a long time, like hundreds of thousands of people joined this community, you know? And so
Yeah.
having more explicit conversation, I will say that Joe Biden has been an important proponent of speaking about grief and bereavement.
Mm.
He's
Well,
made
he
some powerful statements about
right.
it.
Yeah. Well, especially he has gone
Mhm.
through grief personally himself.
Yes.
So, yeah. Yeah. So
But it's normalized it to talk about it.
right, right. And I
Mhm.
like the fact that you described grief as there's a layer
Mhm.
to grief that's not just this one dimensional experience that people go through, that there are layers to that. I like that.
Mhm.
Um so I know that I want to make sure that I respect your time. I even though
Mhm.
you mentioned earlier about time, you
Yeah.
know, time is relative.
Uh-huh.
Um, but at the same time, I know you're very, very busy. And one of the things that I was very, really impressed and interested in is your doula work.
Mhm.
And, as a woman and hoping to be a mother myself, I am just very interested in your work with women's health and being this doula. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more
Mhm.
about that. And I'm assuming that you're working with many women of color as well.
Mhm. Yes. So I love talking about this work because this feels like something that I had a lot of choice in. So as we
Mm,
were talking about before, I was like, I made a lot of choices career wise
right.
because they were accessible and doable and seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I attended my first home birth like 20 years ago, not as a doula, but as like I used to call myself a radical birther, right? Like I was, I would read a lot about midwifery and home
Mm-hmm.
births, and I guess you would call me then what people call like crunchy, like granola y, that's what, like, I think that hippies are called, but
Mm-hmm.
really I was really connected to indigenous birthing ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's what they were. They were natural ways, they were old ways. So I knew that even as a young mom, I was really drawn to that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know when I went back to the Philippines, I was like, there's like no hospital here, like not even like nobody's having their baby in a hospital here, like there's just not a hospital, and then like the clinic is far. So I knew that people were having home births. I'm just now learning about traditional Filipino midwifery, but I know for sure that's how people were born in my mom's village, and
Mm-hmm.
I wish I knew more about that. So even though I'd been like supporting and going to people's home births mainly to like make food or wash dishes, that wasn't like delivering a baby. um, when my kids got older, um, my two youngest girls, I started to, because I've been a mom like almost all my adult life. So I started to really feel this really hard transition for myself
Mm.
when my oldest went away to college. Like even thinking about it now, it brings up really sad feelings for me. And
Mm.
she's graduating, she's coming back home to go to grad school. So it's like, I won't have to be sad, but I remember how sad I felt,
Right,
that I
right.
didn't know what I was outside the context of a mother. Um, and so she went away to college. And also, too, like when you have a young mom, and my husband and I had a lot of like marital turmoil early on, like people kind of count you out, like it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to work for you, like you get those messages that
Mm-hmm.
like you can like mess up your kids or whatever. And then I got this kid going to college, on a soccer scholarship, like she made it, like I
Mm-hmm.
did it. And so I really felt like, wow, I'm in my second postpartum period of birthing women. Like this is my new job, right? Like I raised my kids, and now like I need them to be women, which is like I need to step back and I need to trust and I need to recalibrate. And I was like, maybe they'll want to have kids one day. So even though I know these things about birth, how about I like start to learn a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
in my own pacing and like, understanding. I don't want people to go to like a doula training and then they're like, yeah, doula, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I want to have a lot of experience so that like maybe my kids will have babies or whatever, like in 10 or 15 years, and I will have, kind of honed my skills.
Mm-hmm.
And once I even muttered that, I started to have like traditional midwives and birth practitioners come into my life. Even before I went through kind of like the standardized like doula training and certification, I was
Mm-hmm.
learning from traditional midwives. And I was doing that because as my kids got older, people were noticing that I was kind of more available. And so they started to ask me to come to their births. Mainly because I think I'm a steady hand, like literally, like because I'm a
Mm-hmm.
counselor, and
Right,
it's
right.
like I kind of like know how to deal with stress, that people felt like I could be solid. I could show up. Also, I'm dependable, so if I give somebody my word, I'm going to do it.
Right.
So people who I loved started to ask me to do that. And I was like, if people who I love need me to be of service to them, I should like really know what I'm doing, not just my daughters, but people in my
Right.
community. So that's when I started to get and seek out more training.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a doula for folks I don't know. So it's only people like within my community. And I don't do a ton of births a year, but like I do births every year, you know? And because they're people that I really care about, you know, there's kind of some standard doula protocol, but I'm doing like the gold medal doula stuff. You know, I'm like seeing a lot. I'm seeing them, especially in the pandemic. People have
Mm-hmm.
been very isolated. I want to make sure that both partners are taken care of. You know, I do some things that like maybe other doulas might not, but you know, I that's why, you know, I do like what we call full spectrum care. People are
Mm-hmm.
sensitive about that word. There's some training that goes into that, but I what I do is that I show up and I take care of people during their pregnancy, during
Mm-hmm.
their birth, and after their pregnancy. I also show up and take care of people who have had miscarriages or people who choose to have an abortion, you know, or people who have lost children postpartum. So that's what the full spectrum means is that any part of
Okay.
this, those were all births, you know, those were all um, part of this cycle of life. And
Mm-hmm.
so, whatever part of that somebody needs help with, a doula is somebody who kind of helps in the labor of that. So, some of my colleagues at the university I once had like a pretty long birth. It lasted like 5 days, the labor. And so I was having to cancel a bunch of meetings. You know,
Oh,
usually it's like
wow.
1 to 2 days, and I can like be like, hey, I'm at a birth. People are like, cool. It's like real novel until you're canceling like a full week's worth of meetings, you know? And
Right.
so that's when it started to come up. They're like, "Oh, wow, you took on another career because your friends needed you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like, what do you do for your friends?" You know? So I feel, and I'm learning more about this even at my age. I'm mid-age, I'm middle-aged, you know? That what brings me joy is to help people. That's why I'm a
Mhm.
counselor. That's why I'm a administrator. Like it's not all of these ambitions. It's like, oh, if I have a skill set and I can help you and I can like make your dreams come true or the birth that you want, I can help do that. Like I want to show up for that stuff because, you know, so many of us, we have so many deep lonely pockets in our life where
Yeah.
people don't show up for us. So if I can show up for somebody in those pivotal moments, yeah, I wanna do that, you know? And then, of course, babies are medicine, and
They are.
birth is, like, the original ceremony. It's the
Mhm.
only thing us women, like, women tens of thousands of years ago were doing that, you know? And so it's something that we share with all of the natural world. It's just something
Yeah.
very, very sacred.
Yeah, I honestly think that even though you mentioned that you're not the activist that you envision, I feel like in your current career and what you do in your life, you're very radical, and I really admire that. You just take charge of, your life, and this is what I want to do, and this is, and that in itself is, I feel that that's radical, and
Mhm.
it just a badass way of, owning your power in a sense.
Hmm. Well, thank you for saying that, Donna, because
Yeah, of course.
that means a lot, you know, for you to kind of weave all those things together and see them as I don't necessarily think about my identity. I think about myself as someone of service or like a servant leader or somebody who enjoys being of service to what's important to other people. Um, and I think I'll continue to do that throughout my life. Um, there was a quote, you know, as we're closing up here, I want to actually find that quote because I was sharing it with several people the other day. Um, and it, because I was like, you know what, this is really perfect. It was, it'll take me like 1 second to scroll down to find it again. But it was, I saw it and I was like, oh wow, this is pretty amazing. It says,
Mhm.
reinvent yourself over and over and over and over until you find home. There is no timeline for the soul. So, this is from Malebo Safodi from her book Misbehave. And so she's a Black
Mm.
feminist writer. But I was like,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of us, particularly like, you know, highly educated women, we don't think about having the freedom to reinvent ourselves, to really
Right.
do things that are not just what we're good at, but what we really want to be doing. And I think that I'll be searching for that forever,
Right. Yeah.
because there's like, yeah, like the soul doesn't get tired of really searching for its purpose. So I think that's like how all of those things got tied together with my activist work, my academic work, my birth work. Somehow they are all tied to like, this larger calling, right?
Yeah.
Finding what the purpose is, the radical purpose.
Yes, and that quote really it sums you up.
Hmm.
That's you right there. And I do thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate it. And I know you mentioned before that you don't really have a lot of psychology friends. Well, guess what? Guess what? You got one, sister. And even if you, you got one right here. And I, again,
Hmm.
thank you so much. And I will see you next week. And
Yes,
I'll do that.
absolutely. And thank you, Donna, for thinking about me,
Of
and
course.
being a really great colleague. And I know that you don't brag on yourself, but you are an extraordinarily hard worker, and you really dedicate yourself to your students and to your colleagues. And you're really a servant leader too. So,
Thank you.
spending all of this time with you, I couldn't be more happy to spend a Thursday evening having this conversation. And yeah, being able to reflect on this. So yes,
Thank you
almost at
so
the end of
much.
our LDI fellowship.
I know.
It's been a great gift of this experience for me to meet you. So thank you again.
Likewise. Thank you.
All
Take
right,
care.
you too.
All right. Bye
Bye.
bye.